I would add a note of caution. The Koha user community is more than just a kudos. It's certainly appropriate if you want to, as an organization, do committee work to make a unified position. But for something like this, you also need to discuss it on the Koha mailing list. I don't think the idea of using bug voting and adding categories to track sponsorship status would be particularly controversial among the global user base. But it's not something where but something where definitely a scenario where it would fall flat is if you did something like kudos acting on its own, sent me an email directly making this request. Since this is a project level thing, I highly encourage you to use the global project level communication systems, and that could include the mailing list. Obviously, if you draw a lengthy proposal, putting it up on the wiki, calling a meeting on the Koha IRC channel, but in everything that you do, keep in mind that there are Koha users, some louder than others, some quieter than others, in every single time zone, except possibly some ocean time zone in the Pacific.
I have a question for the vendors now that we've kind of resolved that Auxilla will be the place to go. But with the things that are out there being sponsored by your different customers, could there be a way for the vendors or the developers or whomever to enter these into the database? Because, for example, our list of developments, some of them were just kind of a joint sponsor with somebody who was already sponsoring it. And we have development rights, I think you're calling it. And you have that issue of privacy with your customers where you don't necessarily want to say who you're sponsoring it for. They may not want it to be known. We would probably be very willing to put our list out there, but it just seems like in some cases it might be better for the vendors.
I think that's one of the things we have to speak tomorrow between developers. I think we must improve communication between us. We don't necessarily need to know who is sponsoring what Liblime is doing, but we have to know each other that Liblime is doing this feature, and it should be available in say 3 months. When Chris presented Koha history, he spoke of paid failure, and I said he wrote a monthly letter, and in this letter there were a lot of information, including new non-users, new contributors, and expected features. It was even not sponsored features, it was expected features. So it included sponsored features being developed now, and features that would be a good thing, but they are not here, and it's just an idea. And maybe we should do something to reintroduce something around that.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. And some of the mechanics of that is stuff that we'll be talking about at the developers meeting. One thing to keep in mind is there will definitely be occasions where, despite our best efforts, somebody quote-unquote destroys $50,000 of sponsored developments by coming out of the blue and contributing to the feature. I think it's certainly reasonable to expect that all of the established vendors, assuming that we can smooth over some issues, and can participate in such a system, but don't expect that there will be a perfect control. Sometimes sponsorship contracts will fall apart for various reasons. Sometimes there will just be any number of things, and sometimes you'll know that you as an operator will be sponsoring a project with vendor X, but since the quotes and contracts often precise schedules, you won't necessarily know immediately exactly when. I mean, so it will be an ongoing thing, and I think we can certainly improve the picture. It will never be perfect. And so I think we have to approach this whole thing with an attitude of continuous improvement and small steps, and not trying to solve all of the problems in one small group.
To address what you asked, Vicki, about the vendor entering something, and then we don't, then we cover over what libraries are sponsoring this. I don't have a problem with that. If one of our libraries says, we're going to sponsor this, but we don't want our name on it, then we get into that and say, here's a new development, one of our customers is suggesting this, they've sponsored it, we're working on it, done. The converse could also be partly true. I mean, eventually we're going to figure out that it's LibLime or PTFS or whoever else is working on this, because, well, the code pops up. And it's got the coder's name on it, so we know who did it. But a library's got something, and they go out on Mozilla and say, I'd like to see this. And another library says, well, we're willing to spend some money sponsoring it, and goes out competitively, kind of under the radar, and then suddenly the status changes to sponsored, because they picked somebody, but they didn't say who. That's fine also. You're going to know eventually. When the person gets assigned as the coder, then, the cat's out of the bag. We're not going to be able to prevent that, and that's fine. I won't mind that. But I think it can work both ways. Yeah, if the library wants to stay in the woodwork, then the vendor could say, well, this new feature's been contracted, and we're taking care of that. It's sponsored, and we're on it. If the vendor wants to stay under the woodwork and below the radar for a little while, then the library goes out and enters it and says it's sponsored, and we got somebody working on it, and you'll see it shortly. And then, after that, it gets kind of out of the bag. But I think it can work both ways. And the good news about that is then you don't have an information choke point. Because if the library doesn't go and enter it, I will. If I'm working on something. Makes sense.